I thought that the language of this conference is English, but I was mistaken, and therefore I prepared the talk in English. So far, I'm a deviant here, and I'm not sure whether this is good or bad for me. I will think about that later. So let me come to the talk. I assume that the following situation is given. First of all, a large-scale project is planned, such as the Olympic Games in Hamburg in 2024. A referendum about the realization of the project is to be held, and there is a campaign of advocates and opponents, and people are aware of events in the past or expected events in the future, such as terrorist attacks. There are pre-existing opinions in the population, and they can be influenced by the campaign and the events I just mentioned. These pre-existing opinions refer to three phenomena. First of all, to the attitudes toward the entire project, for example, being in favor or against the Hamburg bid, and attitudes are always here understood as evaluations. Then, pre-existing opinions refer to attitudes toward aspects of the project, and these are any properties of the project. For example, whether you will think that there will be more tourism, whether the costs are high or low, and so on. These are aspects of the project. So relevant are attitudes toward aspects of the project and beliefs about aspects of the project. It is further assumed that the pre-existing opinions towards the project influence the vote, for example, in a referendum. And the individual votes make up or aggregate to the outcome of the referendum. So if you count the votes, then you get the outcome of the referendum. This, what I have said, can be summarized in the following way. There's a campaign and the events, and they have an impact on the pre-existing opinions, which determine the individual votes, which then aggregate to the outcome of the referendum. Note that relationship 4 here is just a correlation. The impacts or the causal effects go via pre-existing opinions. So what has to be discussed or investigated is, first of all, what are the effects of the campaign and the events? And second, which opinions, and that means attitudes and beliefs, have which effects? And I will talk about these questions in this presentation. So the contents of the presentation is as follows. First of all, how to explain and how to influence pre-existing opinions. Second, I will talk about some practical steps to reduce the likelihood of failure of a referendum. First of all, I will focus on measurement. Then I will talk about the research that has been done in Hamburg before the referendum. And I will talk about a strategy of changing beliefs. And this strategy is making credible commitments. Then finally, can a referendum fail due to non-participation of parts of the population? And I come then finally to the conclusion and discussion. So first of all, how to proceed to answer the questions 1 and 2. On the upper left, upper right, you see the scheme before again. So there are two procedures of answering these questions. First is an intuitive procedure. Just think about what factors could be relevant. This is very arbitrary and highly problematic because you don't have any argument for mentioning a factor. For example, the terrorist attacks, were they relevant for the referendum or were they not relevant? Some people say yes, some people say no. So how do they know? Preferable is the application of a theory, and that is a general, empirically confirmed set of statements. A theory tells you in general which factors are relevant, and you can apply a theory to the specific situations. So I will proceed in the second way, and that means I apply theoretical propositions. So, and first of all, the question is how to explain attitudes. So the idea is, if you want to influence attitudes, you must know what the causal factors are. So you have to have a theory. And I will apply a well-confirmed and well-known theory of attitude formation. This is the so-called Fishbein-Eichen theory. And this theory asserts the following. Assume there's an attitude object, Olympic Games in Hamburg, and the question is, why is it valued positively or negatively? Assume that there is a great number of aspects of the attitude object, improved infrastructure and so on, and that these aspects are valued positively and that they are expected to exist to a high extent. In this case, the attitude towards the attitude object will be relatively positive. So the idea is actually simple. You have an attitude object and you have aspects of the object. And if these aspects are valued positively and expected to exist to a high extent, then the attitude towards the attitude object will be relatively positive. So the explanatory variables of this theory are evaluations and in empirical research that can be measured, that could have a value range from -10 to +10, and beliefs about the existence of these aspects. They could have value ranges from 0, that means people do not believe that the aspect will exist, to 1. It is important that the theory asserts an interaction or multiplicative effect. And that means that the impact of one variable depends on the values of the other variable. For example, assume there is a very positive evaluation of something, like having higher tourism. But if people don't believe that that exists, then that has not an impact on the attitude. So you see, the impact of evaluations on the attitude depends on the value of the beliefs and the other way around. So, next question, how to explain beliefs. I assume that citizens believe a statement, for example, the assertion tourism will rise after the Olympics, if the pre-existing beliefs are not extreme, so people are not sure whether they should believe something, and if empirical evidence is provided for a statement, and if the sources of this evidence are trustworthy, always from the perspective of the voters. So no interest group provides some of these evidences, but maybe a neutral group like the Hafen City University. Now then, how to explain voting? Will those who have formed a positive or negative attitude toward the Hamburg bid vote in the referendum? Not necessarily. So many people have a very positive environmental attitude, but nevertheless use their cars instead of public transportation. So research has shown that there is only a weak relationship between attitudes and the behavior, but nevertheless, attitude is one determinant for an individual vote. And the same holds for beliefs. If I believe that the Olympic Games raise tourism in the region, I will not necessarily vote in the referendum. So there are other factors that affect individual votes, but for limitations of time, I will not go into these other factors. So you see here, I modified now the model. The previous model is on the upper right, and this becomes now that aspects of a bid have an impact on the attitudes toward the project, which influence the individual vote, and there are other factors that I will not address. Now some practical steps to reduce the likelihood of a failure of a referendum. I focused on two steps. First of all, measurement, and second, making credible commitment. So important is measurement of the general attitude towards the project, the general attitude towards the Olympics in Hamburg, and evaluations of and beliefs about aspects. Again, beliefs and evaluations can best be influenced if they are known, and they can only be known if you conduct detailed empirical research, and that has to be done in several steps. First of all, measure the intensity of the general attitude towards the project. And this is important. If the attitudes in the population towards the project are very positive, advocates will invest less to change them than if the attitudes are not very positive or even negative. And note that quantitative measurement has to be done. Second step, measure the kinds and number of perceived relevant aspects of an attitude object. Again, you need to know which aspects are relevant if you want to influence them. how do organizers know what aspects are regarded as relevant? So as a hypothesis, you may look at various documents, and you may look at a book by Andrew Zimbalist, Circus Maximus, which is about the best writings I have read about these whole issues. So you may take various possible advantages and disadvantages and then include them in an exploratory study. I will come back to that a little bit later. Third step, measure the intensity of the evaluations and of the beliefs about the aspects, and again, this measurement has to be quantitative. All this has to be measured in a representative survey of the population. But before, as I mentioned already, an exploratory survey should be conducted. Very briefly, one could select about 100 people from different groups, young, old, and so on. Then one could present open questions, and this is a more qualitative procedure, or one may include already some closed questions if you think you have information. And the results of these steps has to be included in this exploratory study, and then finally in the representative survey. And the fourth step, and this is a very important step, is if the data are collected, then you have to estimate the size of the effects. And that we have heard that at the beginning in the first talk, and here multivariate analysis were conducted, and this is important. So you have to distinguish between the average value of a factor, average evaluation of a positive reputation of Hamburg, and the size of the effects of these factors. You see that here in this equation. Assume the attitude is to be explained only by the reputation. So the equation is attitude is equal to the constant plus B plus the reputation. So reputation may have high or low average values in a population, and the effect could be high or small. So you really have to distinguish between both. If there are high average value of an evaluation, that doesn't mean that it has to be effects. So you have to find that out in multivariate analysis. So for organizers, that is relevant because they can better influence attitudes toward a project if they try to change aspects with a strong affect, so with a high B. Then a fifth step is to examine changes of attitude and beliefs over time, so in order to keep track of the changing opinions. You could first take repeated surveys. That means several times different parts of the population are interviewed. What is the problem? So if you have a change of attitude between time 1 and time 2, is that really a change in the opinions or the attitudes? You don't know. Maybe there is just a different sample composition. So you have to check or have to control who is interviewed. Preferable are panel studies. That means the same respondents are interviewed several times. And if you find change here, then that is really a change and not just a sample composition. I summarize, require data and statistical analysis to make a referendum more successful should be, first of all, measure intensity of the general attitudes, then kinds and number of perceived relevant aspects, third, intensity of evaluations of and beliefs about aspects, then look at the effects of these variables, and fifth, measure all these phenomena over time. You might say there was research before the Hamburg referendum. I found 6 studies. Some were sponsored by the DOSB. Only 2 studies, the 2 here and number 6, were available, and I will talk only about these studies, and as far as I can see, the other studies had similar problems. So to what extent is this research satisfactory? First, the February 2015 study. Attitudes toward the Olympic Games in Hamburg were not measured quantitatively. Respondents could only answer whether they were in favor or not. Aspects. It was only measured whether the games influenced the development, Entwicklung, and reputation of the city positively, with answers yes or no. So no quantitative measurement. Development may mean different things, more firms, more housing, more culture. So actually you don't know what you are measuring. and only 2 aspects were measured. No evaluations and beliefs of the aspects were measured, and no exploratory study was conducted, at least it is not mentioned. So November 2015 survey, population of Germany is interviewed. Why is that relevant for Hamburg? Nobody knows. Attitudes towards the Hamburg bit were only measured with yes, no quantitative measurement. Reasons, and these are the aspects, are included, but only in an open question. Respondents are asked to mention reasons in favor or against the Olympic bid. And this is highly problematic, so no list was presented. People are often not aware of the reasons for behavior. Accordingly, you had a high number of missing values here. It is much easier to recognize reasons in a presented list than to remember them if one is aware of the reasons. And in general, this study is more appropriate for an exploratory study, but not as a final representative studies. And no intensities of beliefs and evaluations are measured. Problem of all surveys is they are telephone surveys and have not seen anything about the response rate. In telephone surveys, it's known that the response rate is at best 50% or even lower. And so the question is, are these really representative surveys? Another problem is, and the problem is then that change is not clear because no panel studies were conducted. These were all repeated surveys. The conclusion is, I have argued that detailed empirical research is useful in order to get information about which aspects could be target of a campaign. In regard to the Hamburg bid, there were surveys taken, but they are inadequate to serve as a basis for decision making. Now let me turn to the second major point, making credible commitments. Aspects of a project differ in regard to the extent that organizers can control them. For example, organizers can control to a large extent the cost of a project. For example, they could choose firms and make contracts. There is less or no possibility of control, for example, in regard to the reputation of Hamburg. Promises are made in particular in regard to events organizers can control. Will these promises be believed? Problems are, first of all, low trust. Organizers failed in the past. Example is of course the Philharmonie. Or organizers work with firms or organizations that failed in the past. There may also be skepticism in regard to effectively deal with largely uncontrollable events in the future. For example, in regard to security measures, many people in Hamburg will remember that the terrorists of the 9/11 attacks prepared their activities in Hamburg. So Hamburg is really a liberal city, and they did not interfere with these preparations. So you might remember this, and there might then be skepticism in regard to other measures. What can be done? Organizers could make credible commitments. A commitment means that an obligation is accepted, that such as promising that the cost of a project will not exceed at a certain amount. So that would be a commitment. A credible commitment is given to the extent that those in charge of a project incur high personal costs if plans are not realized. This means that organizers are personally liable for their failures and thus are sanctioned heavily. What are the consequences? Credible commitments of generating positive effects, such as more tourism, increase beliefs that positive events occur and thus promote the acceptance of the project. Credible commitments of preventing negative aspects decrease beliefs about negative events that occur and thus increase the likelihood that the project will be accepted. So then you can think about what could have been credible commitments in the Hamburg bid. I have some thoughts, and maybe they are not realistic. Senate could make a commitment to resign if the costs exceed a certain amount. That would be a commitment that is certainly credible. Each member of the Senate makes a deposit of a high amount with the binding provision that this will be given to some charity organization if costs exceed a certain amount. Laws could be made that increase the possibility of punishments. I don't know whether that is possible according to our constitution. So people who are more familiar with law and constitution should answer this question. Then, no collaboration with those who have failed in the past. No collaboration with certain firms. Very high contractual penalties for failures. And engage organizers with a strong reputation not to fail. Organizers could be the organizer of the Gotthard Tunnel, or Frank Gehry, who was responsible for the Bilbao Guggenheim Museum, which was finished as projected. Have credible commitments been made in Hamburg? The actual situation was promises, promises, promises. Past failures had no negative consequences for those in charge of the project. Example is always the Elbphilharmonie. Those in charge enjoyed their retirement, such as Ole von Beuys, Klaus Wowerheim for Berlin Airport, and Matthias Platzek. Last major point. Could a referendum fail due to non-participation? As is well known, only part of the voters participate in a referendum. That were about 50% in the Hamburg referendum. There is thus selective participation. Could there be an outcome of a referendum that misrepresents the attitudes in the population? I have constructed an example. Assume the population is 1,000. No, oh, good. Thank you. So assume the population is 1,000. Let there be 400 against and 600 in favor, so clear majority in favor. And now there are different participation rates. So those against might think, I will show that I'm against it, so I will participate, although I know that I will lose. So assume that 80% of those against participate. Those in favor might think, oh, we will win anyway, so why should I go to the polls? So assume here 50% of 600 participate. So there are 620 participants, and against are 320. 320 out of 620 are 52%, and 300 out of 620 are 48%. So the vote is now 52 against, but the actual attitude in the population is 40%. Thus, the existing attitudes in the population are reversed in the referendum. So is there an alternative? So one should think about a survey whose results are regarded as binding. And this would be similar to a census. Then in the census you collect actual data, and they are also used for official purposes. I come to the conclusion, can a failed referendum be avoided? Yes, by not holding the referendum. So this is a normative question. Should one hold a referendum? I will not talk about this. This is a long discussion. Maybe a separate conference is relevant for this. But if a referendum is held, somehow the problem of selective non-participation should be tackled. And failure can become less likely if careful, theory-oriented empirical research is undertaken that is the basis for targeting beliefs and evaluations that can be influenced. Sources of messages in a campaign are trustworthy and credible commitments are made. Failure cannot be avoided if there are too many aspects with a negative impact on the attitudes toward the project, and some of these aspects were discussed, but it's not relevant whether the politicians think there are negative aspects. If a referendum is relevant, you need to know what the population thinks, those who cast their vote. And so failure cannot be avoided if there are no trustworthy sources of promises and if there are no credible commitments. So my last point is this.